Well, welcome to Theology in the Real World Part 3. One of the aims of this series is to help us to react to events in a way that pleases God. Often it's the case something happens and we just instinctively respond. And what I want to equip us to do is to stop, think, explore our reactions, and then apply the Bible into those things. It's what we've looked at over the first two sessions, the diagnostic approach. We look at the situation and then we look at the Bible and seek to apply the right treatment that the Bible gives us. Well, of all the events that it's worth reflecting on, undoubtedly the one impacting our lives most at the moment is coronavirus and the consequent lockdown and restrictions. Now, my guess is that around the group you'll have a variety of opinions. Has the government gone too far? Has the government not gone far enough? And so on. Please try to avoid that discussion because I want to press into something different over the next two sessions. In this section, we're going to consider our personal response. And then in the next one, we're going to consider how the culture has responded and what God's truth has to say to our world. But for this session, let's focus personally. And there are two questions I want you to ponder in your groups. First, what have you found hard over the last few months? You have all the different aspects of life. What have you found the most difficult? And then secondly, I want you to consider this question. How does the Bible, and in particular the way in which God has made us, how does that explain why you're finding it hard? Let me explain what I mean. Let me give you an example. One of the things I'm finding slightly difficult over the last few months is just simply the lack of physical contact that I end up having with people. I mean, if you know me well, it wasn't the case that pre-pandemic I was a massive hugger of anybody who came close to me. But even I'm beginning to find that a slight absence over the last few months. So here's one thing I've found hard, a lack of physical contact. Now think for a moment. Is that just a question of me being slightly sort of pathetic and weak and I should just, to use the horrible phrase, man up? No. It seems to me the reason I'm finding that difficult is linked to how God made us. God made us physical beings. He didn't just make us a soul, he made us bodies. And as you work your way through the Bible, you see God commanding us to use our bodies, amongst other things, to show affection to people. And so you find the woman who loved Jesus, anointing him with tears and wiping his feet with her hair. It's a physical act to show affection. Or the Ephesian elders, the church that Paul has been involved in planting. There comes a moment when the Ephesian elders say farewell to Paul, knowing they're unlikely to see him again in this life. And at that point, they don't do an elbow bump. They embrace him because they're showing the warmth of their affection towards him. And indeed, the church is called to greet one another with a holy kiss. And it's a symbol of affection, but it's a physical symbol of affection. And so, in a sense, in denying us that affection unless we kind of live with people, actually, in a sense, we're being called to deny a fundamental aspect of our humanity, part of the way God has made us. And so it should be no surprise that we're finding it hard. Now, what might be the equivalents for you? What are you finding hard? And then secondly, try and press into that question. Why are we finding it hard? How does the Bible help us to understand the fact that we're finding this difficult? So do press pause in your group and try and answer those two questions. Share, what are you finding difficult? How does the Bible help us to understand why we're finding this difficult? Now, as I say, hopefully what you've discovered is that the reason many of us are finding the lockdown, the restrictions painful is because they are calling us to deny some aspect of our humanity, some part of the way in which God has made us. So God says it isn't good for man to be alone. And so some of the loneliness, the sense of being cut off from others, it's right that we should find that painful. You know, the Bible, when celebrating all that God has done, says, sing to the Lord. It doesn't say hum. And again, when we have a sense of God's goodness and we're denied the ability to sing together, that should be something we find hard. It's a denial of the way in which God has made us. And I think it's quite useful, actually, to reflect on that, to reflect on the fact that it is understandable that many of us are finding aspects of the last few months and what's to come difficult. I was recently talking to a friend of mine, and he'd been through a fairly difficult period. And his response to the difficult period, by and large, was to say, come on, stop being pathetic, come on, keep going, keep going. And then finding that he couldn't. And actually in the end he discovered that the only way forward was to acknowledge the pain, was to say, yes, it is right that this is difficult. Yes, things have happened that are wrong, and I should cry over them. I should weep over them. And only then, in a sense, find the ability to get going. And it might be that's what we need to do. All the events of the last few months, all the events that are to come, are a reminder to us that we're not in paradise anymore. We're not in Eden. We're in a world that is badly broken. We live, to a certain extent, in a world under God's judgment. And we weep as a result. This is rubbish, frankly. It's a dreadful place to live at times. And we weep over that, and we long for the day when God will usher in a whole new creation and where he'll wipe every tear from our eyes. And the suffering that we face and the pain that we face are a reminder we're not in paradise, and it causes us to long for the new creation that Jesus will bring in. But there's another perspective that the Bible gives us on times like these. These are great learning opportunities. You know, throughout the Bible, you see suffering as something that shouldn't be there, and yet something that God will use for his purposes. Suffering for the Christian is never meaningless. Let me just talk you through some verses in 2 Corinthians. In many ways, it's my favourite New Testament letter, as it speaks about the various lessons that can be learnt in the hardest of times. So Paul will speak of the suffering that he endures, the persecution, the opposition, the exhaustion, frankly, at times, as well as his own personal pain, his own thorn in the flesh that he refers to in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And yet these are things that he learns from. He learns something about the nature of God, that God is the God of all comfort, the Father of compassion in chapter 1. Paul learns that as he suffers, he knows the comfort of Jesus for a reason, that then he can comfort others. And I guess many of us will know that. Our ability to help others in their pain, to some extent, is linked to our own experience of pain and distress. Or again, Paul learns that he goes through these times of difficulty so that he might not rely on himself, but on God who raises the dead. And again, these times in the pandemic may be occasions where we just end up saying to God, I can't do this. I need you. Or 2 Corinthians 4, Paul's reminded that he's a jar of clay, weak and fragile, to show that the all-surpassing power is from God and not from him. Again, it works a humility, a death to pride in him. Or 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh, and he says there was a reason for it, to keep me from becoming conceited. And he comes to realise that it's when he's weak that God's power and strength rests on him, that when he's weak, he's strong. As you see, these various discomforts that come into Paul's life are for a reason. They teach him humility. They teach him to help others. They teach him something of God's character. They teach him to rely on God in prayer. Or could go elsewhere. James tells us that our trials, well, they lead to perseverance. Again, Paul will make a similar point in Romans. Or Peter in 1 Peter 1 will say that trials have come to show that our faith is genuine. Oh, you see, it's dead easy, isn't it, to trust and to praise God when he's given us loads of good things. But how do you know that you're interested in God and not just the good things he gives us? To be honest, only when suffering comes. Only when so much that we rely on for comfort is taken away. Only then do we actually know that we truly love God for himself and not just for the things he gives us. In other words, times of pain, times of difficulty, oh yeah, they're still difficult, they're still painful. And yet there are also times when we learn lessons that we would never learn on other occasions. And my guess is that will be true for some of us over the last few months. I know for me, I always paid lip service to a phrase like, if it's God's will. Because basically for the whole of my life I planned things and they happened. Except they haven't for the last few months, and suddenly my diary got wiped out pretty much. And I've learned actually my life and the future is totally dependent on God's will. I can't plan the future thinking it's in my control. I'm totally dependent on God. And it may be for each of us, there are lessons we can say that we have learnt. Lessons that we could only have learnt, ironically, in a pandemic and a lockdown. So here are the last two questions to finish this session. What have you learnt in lockdown? What are the lessons that God has taught you? Maybe it is a particular passage of the Bible that has spoken to you. I think it would be an encouragement to the groups if we shared those. So just a moment or two to do that. But remember the main thrust. Yes, it's hard. Don't be surprised it's hard, because basic aspects of our humanity, the way God has made us, are being denied. But don't panic that it's hard. Don't be utterly in despair because it's hard. Because the Bible also tells us that it's in the crucible of painful times that the deepest lessons are learnt. So why don't you discuss that now as a group?